enjoyed the desserts, the cake, the Julie brought, and the fruit and everything else. So this is our Wise Ones meeting, which is wise and inspiring social engagement. We meet the third Wednesday of the month. We try to have people from our temple community speaking, but today we have someone from out of our community, which is wonderful. But before we start, I just wanted to let you know that next month, on Wednesday, October 15th, we'll be having temple member Lori Belay coming. She was an educator here. She's been a member for many years. We've had her here before talking about Jewish art. But this time, she's going to bring her service dog, Merlin, lovely dog.
Horse. I think you meant horse.
Horse, he's like a small horse, definitely. He's something else. So you'll enjoy meeting him. And I'll just read what Lori wrote for the announcements. The program will be, it's a dog's life. Who really is a service dog? What exactly is a service dog and how do I get one? Do I have access rights with my emotional support dog? And she said she wants to explore how dogs have become a prominent part of our local communities. And she offers you to bring your own canine stories, pop memories, and even share some photographs if you like. So she also added adoption, fostering, and training tips included. So I think it would be a wonderful meeting, and I invite you all to come. That's on October 15th, and it will be in the room behind the ornate room. So I hope to see you next month. So I'll hand you over now to Joy Plummer. She's our engagement and programming assistant here at Temple, and she'll tell you about another program we have for our Wise Ones.
I think I need a step stool. This is Paul. Hello, everybody. I am Joy Plummer. I am the Assistant Director of Engagement here at Temple Isaiah. And I do programming and events for our senior community and more. Next month, we have a Wise Ones Out and About program at Moraga for Monarchs. So we're going to the Monarch Garden in Moraga. We're going to have a picnic lunch, which you should bring yourself for you. And then we'll have a talk from Julie Stagg, who is the president of, no.
She's one of two people who started this project of having a monarch habitat garden, and it's beautiful. It's grown over the last 4 years, and she's so informed about everything monarch, so I hope you can make it.
I hope you can make it too. So watch your Shavua Tov, which comes out on Sunday mornings, so that you can sign up, so we know you're coming. And if you ever need anything, please find me on our website, and I will help you get to whatever you need. So it's good to see so many of you here, and I will see you again soon.
We have more people coming, so we need more chairs, which is fantastic. Great, so. Okay, now we have our leader who wants to give us some announcements about some other learning opportunities.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Julie. And it's wonderful to have my colleague, Jerry Hennig, here today to tell us about America's presidents and what we didn't learn in history classes. I just wanted to take the opportunity to tell you about OLLI, our Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Cal State's campus out in Concord. And we have our program online, and in fact, it's already started. We go from September through to the end of December, and I copied out about 20 copies of our program. It's all, you can check it out online, and if anybody wants a copy of the program, I have them distributed here. Just put up your hand. If you're a couple, please just take one copy. But our OLLI, our Racial Lifelong Learning Institute, is for all seniors 55 and older. So everyone here qualifies.
I don't qualify.
Except the youngster who gives us wonderful cake.
Thanks. Anybody like to?
Okay, so you guys know this part is the prayer before I introduce our speaker. And we're talking about this country today, so I wore my stars. And I am pulling the prayer from our prayer book for our country. O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace. May we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and our country be sound in body and spirit. I don't necessarily think it matters what you believe right now. I think we all agree that we need some prayers for the United States. And we're gonna have fun today as we learn from Professor Hennig. And he is a professor emeritus of history at Cal State East Bay. And he received the Outstanding Professor Award and won the Pi Kappa Delta Best Lecturer Award 4 times. And I can tell you just from talking to him for a minute, he's very fun. He's the author of 4 books, including the one that's on the back table, and has received national recognition. This is the one that's on the back table, and it's available for purchase. In addition to winning the Best Indie Book of 2024, it was the 2025 National Indie Excellent Award finalist. And he's also published a bunch of articles on American political, social, and military history. He likes to jog and read and travel, but he mostly loves his grandchildren, so I know that many of you have that in common with him. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Professor Hennig. I don't know why we have this little echo, I'm sorry about that. And I'm going to turn the lights off in the main part so that you can see the screen, okay? Welcome.
I'll work with this microphone, make sure that I get through.
That sounds great.
There is a little echo, but okay with everyone? Yeah. Good. Julie, I'm sorry, thank you for the introduction. And I just want to have one addendum. I think you'll find a note that I am the author of 4 or 5 books. One is an edited book. But in any case, this is the only book I published that was designed for a mainstream audience, which my publisher likes to call for the general nonfiction reader. All of my previous books were geared, in my case, my field of specialization is the Civil War. And I published those books, frankly, for professorial advancement. And it worked, but the labor of love was this particular book. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. With that said, let's check my watch. I want to bid you, now I can bid you a good afternoon and a warm welcome. When I began research for America's presidents, my objective was to unearth little-known events in the lives of our former chief executives. By doing so, I wanted to gain greater insight into their character and conduct, which should help provide some further insight in terms of a pivotal question. How does one explain the fact that only 3 presidents, Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, attained the status of presidential greatness? Why didn't others rise to similar heights? Although some came close, the vast majority fell short, and more than a handful was simply terrible. While I have no desire to rank our chief executives, I would like to focus on their lives through lenses rarely used by historians. For example, a significant number of our presidents, for various reasons, never wanted the job in the first place. Hard to believe, when most candidates have battled tooth and nail to win the office. Even more difficult to comprehend is that one of those elected candidates was none other than George Washington. Indeed, our very first president did not want the position. Having led America's Revolutionary Army for 8 years, and later presiding over the Constitutional Convention, Washington felt that he had served his country to the utmost. Besides, at 56 years of age, he was concerned about his longevity. Men in his family rarely lived past 50. Would he survive a 4-year term? Finally, he had severe financial problems. Like most planters in Virginia, Washington was land rich, but cash poor. How would he pay off his debts if he accepted the office? Eventually, he succumbed to the mounting pressure and agreed to assume the presidency, though he harbored serious doubts about his decision. Just before taking the oath of office, Washington confided to those close to him, "I feel like a culprit going to my execution." Another general, Mexican-American war hero Zachary Taylor, also had misgivings. To those who wanted to draft him, Taylor made it clear, "I do not care a fig about the office." And he went on, "I have always been against the elevation of a military chief to that position." A century later, another victorious general, Dwight D. Eisenhower, also expressed his reluctance. "I'm a soldier," he declared, "and I have no political ambition at all. Besides getting into the thick of politics, hitting the campaign trail, cutting deals, raising money, all that nitty-gritty was beneath him." their reservations, Taylor and Eisenhower accepted the nomination of their parties. And they went on to win their respective elections. In Eisenhower's case, twice. And there were still others opposed to taking the job. William Howard Taft would have preferred to serve as Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court instead of Chief Executive of the United States. During his presidency, which afforded him little, if any, joy, Taft loomed to 355 pounds, the heaviest man to hold the office. Later, President Warren G. Harding nominated Taft to serve as Chief Justice of the Court, which he presided over for a decade, the happiest years of his life, at which time, incidentally, he lost nearly 100 pounds. Nor should we lose sight of at least two vice presidents who genuinely had no desire to occupy the White House. In early July 1881, after President James A. Garfield was shot by an assassin at a Washington, D.C. train station, and over the next 10 weeks lay dying, Republican Party leaders were deeply concerned about Garfield's successor. As one exclaimed, Chet Arthur, President of the United States? Good God! He was referring to Vice President Chester Alan Arthur, a former political boss who had never held elective office except for the vice presidency. What would have thrown the party leaders into a greater frenzy was that Arthur agreed with him. He understood that he was not suited for the office, and he didn't want it. When the news of President Garfield's death was announced, reporters rushed to Arthur's home in New York City, eager for his reaction. There was no public statement. According to Arthur's butler, the vice president was sitting alone in his room, sobbing like a child, with his head on his desk and his face buried in his hands. And more than a half century later, another vice president had no desire to move into the White House. Contrary to popular belief at the time, Vice President Harry Truman did not harbor presidential ambitions. He had no choice, however, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt suffered a fatal stroke on April 12, 1945. I have a vague memory of that day. My sister was born on April 12th. I was just about 3 years old at the time, attending her birthday party, and there was a good deal of fun, everyone was laughing, and then suddenly, and I vaguely remember this, however, it became somber when I got news of FDR's passing. I keep searching my memory. I asked my sister, she confirmed that was during that party. She is 4 years older than I, so she's 74, I'm just 71. Joking. In any case, the death of FDR always comes to mind. In fact, when Truman completed Roosevelt's unexpired term in 1948, he was not interested in seeking a second term, and let it be known that he would step aside and support Dwight D. Eisenhower as the Democratic presidential nominee. But the general refused. To sweeten the offer, Truman was willing to go on the ticket in 1948 as Eisenhower's vice presidential running mate. Now wait a minute. Incredible. Unprecedented. take the second spot on the ballot, yet Truman was dead serious and looked forward to a favorable outcome. Eisenhower and I could be elected, he wrote in his diary, and my family and I would be happy outside of this great white shell known as the White House. Eisenhower never accepted the offer. Then give him hell, Harry kicked in, and Truman went on to win a second term. Perhaps no candidate was more hesitant to take the oath of office than Warren G. Harding, who firmly believed that he did not have the ability to do the job. A small-town Ohio newspaper editor who rose to become a U.S. Senator, Harding was content to remain in the Senate. But in June 1920, after the Republican National Convention was hopelessly deadlocked, party leaders had no choice but to consider Harding as their presidential candidate. As one observer summed it up, Harding was nominated because there was nothing against him, and the delegates wanted to go home. Harding was shocked by the news. The only thing I really worry about, he admitted privately, is that I might be elected. Elected he was, receiving the largest popular majority in American presidential history up to that time. Despite the vote of confidence expressed by the American people, Harding was in over his head. Every issue, whether domestic or foreign, seemed beyond his capabilities. My God, he cried out on one occasion, this is a hell of a place for a man like me to be. Overwhelmed by his shortcomings, Harding was also distressed by reports that many of his appointees, a number of whom were his boyhood friends, were involved in a variety of crooked schemes. And to add to his woes, he was deeply concerned that his ongoing affair with a man, Brinton, 30 years his junior, and the mother of his daughter, might be made public. This man had a lot on his plate, given the fact that he had a history of nervous breakdowns. In his late 20s and early 30s, he suffered, as best as we can determine, 5 major emotional collapses, to the point where he entered a sanitarium, the famous one in Battle Creek, Michigan, run by the brother of the founder of the Kellogg Cereal Company. And beyond that, poor man also had a heart condition. In any case, in the summer of 1923, Harding took a trip to the Pacific Coast to shore up his political base and to find solace outside of Washington. On August 2nd that summer, in a San Francisco hotel room, Warren G. Harding suffered a stroke and died at the age of 57. While there were those who were reluctant to seek the office, others were willing to do anything, legal or otherwise, to win the prize. Take, for example, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate in the 1968 presidential contest, a contest that was waged during the war in Vietnam. Though his early poll numbers were solid, Nixon did not want to leave a stone unturned, having lost to John F. Kennedy 8 years earlier in one of the closest elections in presidential history. Nixon was concerned that the ongoing peace talks in Paris, arranged by President Lyndon Johnson, might result in a ceasefire between the North and South Vietnamese. This could derail his candidacy and give his Democratic opponent, Johnson's vice president, who was Johnson's vice president and Democratic nominee in 1968? Someone. Who said Humphrey? You're right. All of you are right. If those peace talks succeeded, then Humphrey would get a decisive advantage. The communist North Vietnamese had already arrived in Paris. For the conference to succeed, the South Vietnamese, supported by the United States, would have to take part as well. Living up to the nickname his rivals bestowed upon him, what was Nixon's nickname? Somebody. Tricky Dick. And that went into full motion. Nixon sent word to the president of South Vietnam telling him not to attend the peace conference in Paris. No matter what the Johnson administration had promised him, Nixon noted, once elected, he would offer a better deal. The president of South Vietnam did not show up in Paris. There are those who believe that if not for Nixon's mischievous interference, the war in Vietnam would have ended 70 years sooner than it did. On the other hand, there are those who have argued that the South Vietnamese president, with or without Nixon's mischievous interference, never intended to come to the table. Like so many historical might-have-beens, there is no final answer. But one thing should not be overlooked. The Republican nominee in 1968 was gambling with lives, tens of thousands of American and Vietnamese lives. As Nixon's most recent biographer, John A. Farrell, has concluded, of all of Richard Nixon's actions in a lifetime of politics, his attempt to sabotage the Paris Peace Conference was the most reprehensible. One of Richard Nixon's predecessors shared a similar personality. Like Nixon, America's 31st president, Herbert Hoover, was uneasy around people. It was also described as a difficult man to know, communicate with, and befriend. Unlike Nixon, however, Hoover was an honest and principled man. Hoover's most faithful mistake was choosing politics as a profession. He was an introvert in a profession that rewards extroverts. Introvert he was. Soon after arriving at the White House, Hoover had devised a system to avoid any physical encounters with the staff. Preferring to have them out of sight, 3 bells were rung to alert maids, butlers, door attendants, laborers, and any other personnel to disappear into closets, into unoccupied rooms, or wherever they couldn't be seen while Hoover strolled the corridors of the White House. I'm convinced that Hoover suffered from what today we call Asperger's. I didn't include it in my book because I just know reviewers with Skinny Alive accusing me of practicing what was called psychobiography. And I just didn't want to expose myself to that kind of criticism. But I am convinced he was a victim of Asperger's. Hoover's attitude toward the White House staff was indicative of his lack of social skills and his disinterest in the lives of average Americans. Just when the country desperately needed a chief executive with an entirely different personality. Hoover had the singular misfortune to preside over the worst economic downturn in American history. By the time he left office, America's national income had been cut in half. 5,000 banks had crashed, wiping out 9 million savings accounts. Bear in mind, those savings accounts were not insured either by the government or privately. They disappeared. And more than 15 million workers, about 25% of the workforce, had lost their jobs. At first, Hoover was committed to a balanced budget and was unwilling to unleash the necessary federal funds to stimulate the dying economy. When he did, his major relief programs were predicated on the assumption that if you help those at the top income brackets, the benefits will ultimately trickle down to those below. The problem was, what was the problem with that theory of the trickle-down theory? The benefits did not trickle down. And Hoover, remote and distant, had neither the personality nor inclination to reverse course and provide relief from the bottom up. What's interesting to note is that Hoover, a poor orphan boy from Iowa, became the spokesperson for the rich and well-to-do, while his successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was born into privilege and wealth, became the champion of the people. Personal, jovial, and fierce, FDR, as he was often referred to, though he wasn't the first president to be referred to by his initials. This is a difficult bit of a trivia question, but I'll throw it out there. Who was the first president to be referred to by his initials?
Theodore Roosevelt.
Say it again?
Theodore Roosevelt.
Who was that? Who said that? Yes, you're absolutely right. Theodore Roosevelt was commonly known as TR. And by the way, Teddy Roosevelt was FDR's fifth cousin. But the trend referring to presidents as by their initials really began with FDR. After Roosevelt, his successor, Harry Truman, was commonly referred to as HST, although the S stood for nothing. Truman inserted it because he liked the melodious flow of the letters. After Truman's successor, that is, didn't really need reference by initials because he was affectionately known as Ike. But Eisenhower's successor is also commonly known, John F. Kennedy, that is, as JFK. And Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as LBJ. And they're pretty much the trend toward referring to presidents by their initials came to a halt, although Johnson's successor, Richard Milhous Nixon, wanted to revive it, so he often referred to himself as RMN speaking. RMN is saying this, and he was hoping the press would pick it up. The press hated him so much that it was just what that the way to antagonize him was to ignore his reference by initials. So it pretty much ended with LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. In any case, FDR was the extrovert America desperately needed during what was known as the Great Depression. It's easy to forget that many of the programs we take for granted today, Social Security, minimum wage, government insurance for bank accounts, and federal oversight of the stock market, to name but a few, were implemented under the aegis of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who incidentally was the only major leader in recorded history who could not walk or or sand without help. As many of you no doubt know, Roosevelt was a victim of polio, was struck in late life. He was 39 years of age when he was rendered by the disease, virtually paralyzed from the waist down. During his first presidential campaign in 1932, he struck a deal with what today we would call the media, at that time it was called the press. And he asked the press not to either take photographs of him in a wheelchair, and by the way, this is only one of 2 photographs that we have of Roosevelt in a wheelchair, or using crutches, or being transported, carried by Secret Service agents from his car to a podium, or in any circumstances to suggest that he was disabled. His feelings about this, and these are his words, a crippled president would have a much more difficult time resolving the issues of a economically crippled nation. In any case, hard to believe, but the press kept its word. There were neither stills, nor newsreels, or anything revealing that Roosevelt could not stand or walk without assistance. In fact, the average American was unaware of Roosevelt's disability. In fact, world leaders were unaware. When the King and Queen of England visited Hyde Park, visited the Roosevelts at their estate in Hyde Park in the Hudson Valley of New York, they were astonished to see that Roosevelt could not stand or walk without help. Even Joseph Stalin, the dictator of Russia, who had spies all over the world, was stunned when he first met Roosevelt at their first wartime conference to find that the leader of the United States was so severely disabled. Disability notwithstanding, Roosevelt had an enormous impact on the course of American history, including an impact on the future post-war generation of political leaders. And one of his proteges was indeed a young congressman from Texas and a future president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson was deeply influenced by FDR. This helps to explain in part some of the progressive measures Johnson signed into law not long after entering the White House. The Civil Rights Act, Medicare, the Voting Rights Act, aid to education, immigration reform, conservation, and the war on poverty, measures that would have a huge impact on the lives of average Americans. A transformational president, to be sure, but Lyndon Johnson had his demons, plagued by a host of insecurities, political and personal. It's no surprise that he was extremely disliked by those who served him. As a human being, Johnson was a miserable person, a foul-mouthed bully and egotist. This was how presidential press secretary George Reed characterized the man he had worked for in various capacities for a decade and a half. Many of those who served in the White House, whether it be a maid or a top presidential advisor, remembered President Johnson as a crass, boisterous character who, in the most demeaning terms, often shouted at them, questioning their competence. Johnson's outbursts were one thing, but his vulgar actions were something else. I want you to listen closely to how Johnson's award-winning biographer, Robert A. Carroll, explained his scandalous behavior. None of the body parts customarily referred to as private were private when the parts were Lyndon Johnson's. As a brash young congressman, for example, Johnson was not the least hesitant to brag about his most distinctive private part, which he proudly called Jumbo. And if challenged, he was not reluctant to exhibit it to justify his name. As president, Johnson's exhibitionism did not lessen. Occasionally in the middle of a meeting, Johnson would declare a swimming break for all in attendance. The group would then assemble at the White House indoor pool, where LBJ would strip down, insisting that everyone swim in nude. The president would mock those reluctant to do so. They either complied or left in humiliation, and that included 2 of his cabinet ministers. This level of intimacy was taken a step further. When LBJ would interrupt the conversation and announce that he had to go to the bathroom, moving the discussion there. Sitting on the commode, he would continue to talk as if this setting was perfectly normal for a meeting. Hayes Redmond, a newly hired assistant to press secretary Bill Moyers, who incidentally just passed away recently, and Moyers had replaced George Reed, Redmond was curious about these goings-on. He pleaded with Moyers, "Gee, I never get to see the president when he's doing these outrageous things everyone tells me about. And the next time he does one, I want to be in on it. I'm working for the man, and I want to see this." Several days later, Moyers called Redmond and urged him to come to the president's bedroom on the 2nd floor of the White House. At first, all appeared as usual. The president's older daughter, Linda Bird, and Mrs. Johnson were there. A secretary was taking dictation, and LBJ was lying on his side in his bed, facing the room. There was a nurse on the other side of the bed, and Bill Moyers, another staff member, and someone from one of the networks were also in the room. In all, there were 8 people in the room. As Johnson was switching channels on the 3 television sets, barking dictation to his secretary and yelling at Moyers, Hayes Redmond wondered why all this was unusual. Moyers gestured discreetly for him to move to the other side of the president's bed, where the nurse was stationed. Then Moyers whispered to Redmond, "Well, you wanted a good one, you got a good one. He's having an enema." And my notes had this large word in block letters reading pause. So let's just think about that for a second. When I discovered this at the LBJ library, it was the diary of Hayes Redmond's wife. And when he would come home from the White House, he would tell me these things when we didn't have dinner. And then she would go back and she would record this word for word. And incredible, but it's not only Redmond's word, but others have confirmed that as well. Perhaps what is less shocking but unsettling are the presidents who have broken their marriage vows. As best as can be determined, the only 19th century president to cheat on his wife was James A. Garfield. The other presidents who committed adultery did so in the 20th and 21st centuries. The most flagrant offenders have served since 1960. Prior to the mid-20th century, presidential adultery usually involved one partner, or at the very most two. But those chief executives who were unfaithful to their wives in the post-1960 era were serial womanizers, including John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. John F. Kennedy's track record as a philanderer before his marriage and his countless sexual indulgences afterwards probably surpassed in sheer numbers any of his future colleagues. When I'm speaking about sheer numbers, I'm not speaking of dozens of women, scores of women, hundreds of women, but I'm speaking of thousands of women. Among Kennedy biographers, there is no question that JFK's sexual addiction can be explained by the profound influence of his father, Joseph P. Kennedy, one of the wealthiest men in America. An infamous womanizer, Joe made no effort to hide from his sons that he was cheating on their mother, and he went on to encourage them as well to be sexually adventurous. Dad told all the boys to have sex as often as possible. JFK once confided to a family friend. In the world of Kennedy men, women were objects to be pursued and conquered. Like his father and brothers, John F. Kennedy was addicted to the excitement of the chase and conquest. As Kennedy entered the public arena, there was no sign of any change in his attitude. For most men, marriage is a turning point in their lives, when they choose to be faithful to whom they marry. Jacqueline Bouvier, or Jackie as she was known worldwide, was an ideal mate. The daughter of a socially prestigious Catholic family, she was beautiful, charming, and intelligent, with all the necessary credentials to advance her husband's political ambitions. But that was not enough. JFK simply could not commit to one woman. Once in office, he used all the resources at his disposal: presidential aides, Secret Service agents, military attaches, White House personnel, and reporters to assist in securing women to satisfy his cravings. In fact, in the Kennedy White House, there were presidential assistants stationed at various points in the residence, and their job was to survey tourist groups as they moved through the building. And if they spotted an attractive woman, they would approach her and ask her if she wanted to meet the president on a personal level. There is indisputable evidence available to confirm this, as incredible as it might seem to you. Aside from these chance encounters, Kennedy had his regulars at the White House. Mary Meyer, an attractive, politically well-connected 41-year-old who, among other things, introduced pot smoking to the president. And there was Minnie Beardsley, a 19-year-old intern who had lost her virginity to Kennedy and engaged in an 18-month affair with him. There were also two presidential secretaries, Priscilla Ware and Jill Cowan, who had threesomes with JFK and periodically swam with him nude in the White House pool. And there was Judith Campbell, the seductively beautiful girlfriend of mafia boss Sam Giancana. Frank Sinatra had introduced her to Kennedy in Las Vegas during his presidential campaign, and he didn't forget her. They had romantic encounters in New Hampshire, New York, California, and some 20 times in the White House. Ironically, most of the women who were intimate with JFK did not speak highly of his lovemaking. A common complaint was that he made love with one eye on his watch. With subtle wit, actress Angie Dickinson described her sexual encounter with Kennedy as the most memorable 30 seconds of my life. The 1960s sex goddess Marilyn Monroe said that Kennedy made love like an adolescent. Whatever his deficiencies in the bedroom, a far more consequential question needs to be addressed. Did John F. Kennedy's excessive extramarital activity negatively impact his presidential decision-making? At least one contemporary, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, was concerned. He had cultivated a close relationship with the young president and was not reluctant to tell him that the inordinate time and energy he spent committing adultery posed a danger to his position as president of the United States. But that Kennedy's slander actually caused him to commit errors in judgment as America's chief executive? The short answer is no. Thus far, there is no credible evidence that JFK's extramarital activity, excessive though it was, distracted him from doing the job he needed to do. Still, there are legitimate questions to be raised, though we have no way of knowing the answers. If John F. Kennedy had lived to win a second term and continued to engage in his unrestrained sexual activity, would his actions have had consequences this time around? I barely scratched the surface of what I have unearthed in my book, America's Presidents. But even this cursory overview suggests an incontrovertible conclusion. For the most part, America's presidents were all too human, with strengths, frailties, aspirations, and, to be sure, peculiarities. That isn't to discount the fact that some of our chief executives performed Herculean tasks. George Washington, who founded the country, Abraham Lincoln, who preserved it, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who rescued it from economic collapse and then led it to victory in the greatest war of all time. Beginning in 1948, presidential scholars conducted a polling of presidents. They published their rankings of presidents, and these polls were periodically reissued roughly every decade after that. It started in 1948, a group of professors from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and one or two other universities in the Northeast published their findings, and then other professors got involved as well. And these polls ranked presidents. And what's interesting to note, every one of these polls from 1948 to the present time had as the top three presidents Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These were considered our greatest presidents. In 2023, a poll was conducted by 237 presidential scholars. It was known as the Presidential Greatness Project. And if you remember that name, the name of the poll, Presidential Greatness Project, if you Google that, you'll have a listing of all 45 presidents from number 1 to 45. What made this poll 2 years ago so significant was that it was not conducted by simply people from academia, professors from universities. Because most of these polls, people dismissed said, well, these professors are liberal, they're inclined to the Democratic Party. But this poll, the Presidential Greatness Project, did not include just professors from universities, but it included independent scholars. It included jurists, attorneys, people who wrote books about it. I'm still waiting for my invitation to this group. I'll let you know when I get it. But in any case, people who wrote books about the presidents and were well received. And the 237 presidential scholars who conducted the Presidential Greatness Project came from all walks of life, not only various occupations, but also they represented a broad swath of the political community. There were Republicans, Independents, Democrats, Conservatives, Moderates, Liberals, and so on. But the only difference in the top 3 presidents was instead of Washington being #1 in 2023, and I agree with these fellows, Agnew, who did this, Lincoln was considered #1, Washington #2, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt as #3. So it wasn't a major shift in the top 3, and they were still considered our greatest presidents. The next group, from 4 to 10, in the scale of 1 to 45, were considered near great presidents, and they included Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, and the man who didn't even want to be president, Harry Truman. And this you'll find interesting, Barack Obama was #7. Number 8 was Dwight D. Eisenhower. I never knew if you had 2 photos, but images, but I think you'll also find that intriguing. Number 9 was Lyndon B. Johnson. And number 10 was John F. Kennedy. And they included this poll in 2023 also included our most recent presidents, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Biden was ranked very high. He was ranked as number 14, very close to near great. What do you think Donald Trump was? Well, if you listen to Donald Trump, he's told us point blank that he's the best president we've ever had, even better than Lincoln. He was ranked number 45, our worst president. You know, after the debate that he conducted with Biden, unfortunately Biden simply was not up to it. He had referred to himself, Trump, had referred to himself as the greatest president, the best president we've ever had. And Biden was trying to, he was aware of the Presidential Greatness Project, but he just couldn't get it out and explain to the audience and to Trump that presidential scholars thought otherwise. In any case, in future elections, when we head to the polls to decide who should occupy the White House, can we learn from our former presidents what to seek and what to avoid? What stands out immediately is that those who have served as chief executives were far more effective when they possessed a large dose of compassion, a willingness to use government to improve the quality of life of the many, not the few. Lincoln, for one, was realistic but compassionate in how he viewed the role of government. As he put it, and these are Lincoln's words, the government should help people whatever they need to have done but cannot do for themselves. For those who can do it as well for themselves, government ought not to interfere. Another major theme that can be extracted from my findings is this. Many of our presidents were inclined to deceive the public. More than a handful were predisposed to tell falsehoods, and some were chronic, if not pathological liars. Given the complexity of the presidency, no one is naive enough to expect absolute honesty. Nevertheless, The American people deserve as much truthfulness as possible. A third and final consideration to bear in mind when voting for a presidential candidate is that he or she should have a firm grasp of America's history. How can you govern a country without knowing the origins of its basic values and institutions? In the end, compassion, truthfulness, and a solid grounding in our past are the traits we should seek in our prospective presidential candidates. More than 2 centuries ago, America's second president, John Adams, offered the following advice: the people ought to consider the president's office as the indispensable guardian of their rights. And he quickly added, the people cannot be too careful in the choice of their presidents. You've been an engaging and attentive audience tonight. Thank you.
Professor Hennig will be back there if you want to grab one of his books, maybe he'll sign it for you. And I want to give a special thanks. First of all, that was an amazing talk, so one more round of applause. I think you've ever been as engaged the entire hour as we just were. No offense to anyone else, but that was really fun. And I want to give a special thanks to Carolyn Sladnick, who gave us this idea after hearing a talk by Professor Hennig at Ollie. And so thank you for helping us come up with this. And by the way, we're going to be planning the first half of next year shortly. If you have any ideas for upcoming programs that you would like to bring, please do. Jan and I, after 10 years, are probably needing a little bit of fresh ideas. So if you have something, let us know. Thank you.